Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Bronx Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to introduce our panel today, Building Better Worlds, and to introduce our moderator, Arvin Ahmadi.
Hello.
Arvin grew up outside Washington, D.C. He graduated from Columbia University and has worked in the tech industry. When he's not reading or writing books, he can be found watching late-night talk show interviews and editing Wikipedia pages. His novels include Down and Across, Girl Gone Viral, and the forthcoming How It All Blew Up. Arvin, I'll pass it on to you.
All right. Thank you, Olivia. I'm really excited for the Building Better Worlds panel. I'll just quickly describe the panel, read the description before we jump into everyone's bios and names, and then get right to it. So, when the outside world seems as unbelievable as fantasy, relatable, young adult authors create new worlds from what they know. These speculative fiction authors bring lived experiences to worlds built from fantastical kingdoms, code, a magical circus, and Puerto Rico threatened by both natural and fantastical forces. Join them in a discussion right here, right now, about their inspiration for the worlds they built. All right, so let's get this started. First, I want to introduce Janella Angeles. Janella is a Filipino-American writer who works in children's publishing by day while penning novels by night. She graduated summa cum laude from Emerson College with a BA in writing, literature, and publishing, but found the most valuable way of learning to write was in creating glorious Harry Potter fan fiction and reading obscene amounts of books. Also relatable. She currently resides... I love also getting everyone's real-time, like up-close reaction to having their bios read. This is actually maybe the real show going on. Janella currently resides in Massachusetts, and Where Dreams Descend is her first book. There's a beautiful cover. All right, on to our next panelist, Davina Cardinal. Anne is a novelist and director of student recruitment for Vermont College of Fine Arts, VCFA, where she also earned her MFA in writing. She comes from a long line of Puerto Rican writers, including poets Virgilio and Jose Antonio Dávila, and her cousin, award-winning author Tere Dávila. 5 Midnights was her first solo novel. We got the book, we got the book. There's that lovely cover. Visit her online at www.anndavidacardinal.com and follow her on Twitter at @AnnDCardinal. We love social media. All right, thank you, Anne. Next up, we have Elizabeth Lim. Elizabeth, oh, and I love the way of your cover in the background on your shelf. That's so lovely.
Thanks.
All right. Elizabeth grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she was raised on a hearty diet of fairy tales, myths, and songs. Before becoming an author, Elizabeth was a professional film and video game composer, and she still tends to come up with her best book ideas when writing near a piano. An alumna of Harvard College and the Juilliard School, she now lives in New York City with her husband and her dog. Spin the Dawn is her first original novel. There's Spin the Dawn, also in the background. And its companion in the Blood of Stars series, Unravel the Dusk, will be published in summer 2020. There's the lovely art. For more information, she's online at elizabethlim.com or on Twitter and Instagram. Finally, last but not least, we have Coco Ma. Hello, Coco.
Hello.
So many amazing books on those shelves. Coco is a Canadian pianist and the 19-year-old author of the Shadow Frost trilogy. There it is. Book 1. More books. She wrote the first book of the trilogy at the age of 15 and hasn't looked back since. After learning the piano during her childhood, she has performed on some of the world's greatest concert stages and graduated with a pre-college diploma in piano performance from the Juilliard School in New York City. How awesome is it, by the way, that we have two, not one, but two Juilliard grads repping Juilliard on this panel. Wow. I feel like we need some like epic panel music now. Currently, Coco studies at Yale University. All right, let's get this party started. So I want to start by going around just real simple and having everyone talk a little bit about their books. So Coco, do you think maybe we could start with you and just give us a quick summary of the Shadow Frost trilogy?
Sure. Okay, so Shadowfrost is a YA fantasy novel about a princess who has one job, and it is to kill a demon that cannot be killed. So, problems already. Godstorm is the sequel. I actually just got the arcs in the mail like 5 days ago or
Oh
something
my
like
God,
that.
congrats.
So that was
Yeah.
super exciting. And that's coming out in October. And then the third book will come out next fall. So yeah.
Nice. All right, Janella, how about you?
So, Where Dreams Descend is YA fantasy, the first book in a duology that's pitched as Phantom of the Opera meets Moulin Rouge and like a twist of the night circus. And it follows an ambitious, powerful showgirl named Kalia who must enter this magical competition. But it quickly becomes a dangerous game behind the scenes as people go missing, things start happening. Yeah.
All right, Anne.
My Five Midnights is a novel, takes place in Puerto Rico, and it's about El Cuco, who is the sort of like the Latino boogeyman. And it's about addiction and identity, and its sequel, companion book, comes out on June 2nd. Oh my God, that's next week.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's called Category 5. When I was writing Five Midnights, Hurricane Maria happened, and so it's sort of like Puerto Rico is pre-Maria and then post-Maria, and so you sort of can't not address it. And so I took the same characters and brought them to Vieques, an island off of the main island of Puerto Rico. And they were it takes place after Maria. So they're trying to sort of, the island's recovering and there's a land grab and there's supernatural beings and corpses turning up with missing hearts. And so it has both the supernatural and the natural.
Yes. Amazing. And then Elizabeth, tell us about your book.
Okay. Spin the Dawn is pitched as Mulan meets Project Runway, and it's about a young seamstress who has to disguise herself as her brother in order to enter the imperial competition to become the royal tailor. And along the way, she was tasked with sewing 3 magical dresses of the sun, the moon, and the stars. The sequel, Unravel the Dusk, comes out in about 6 weeks on July 7th. It's also pretty soon.
All right. So one of the common themes that I love about these fantasy and speculative books in particular is this idea of entering a new world and then discovering this dark underbelly in that new world. I mean, Elizabeth, in your book, you have this cutthroat backstabbing going on in the tailor competition, right? And in Where Dreams Descend, Janella, you have this behind the scenes of the conquering circus. And so I'm really curious for all of you, what's the most exciting and interesting part of layering in that kind of a dark underbelly of letting the darkness unfold in your world? And then what's also the most challenging part of kind of mapping that throughout your book? Elizabeth, is it okay if we start with you?
Yeah, sure. I'm formulating my answer. I guess I would go back to when I was first starting out as a writer and learning about the craft. Like when I was very young and I wrote my first stories, I wanted only good things to happen to my characters. I was like, they're going to be perfect in every single way, from how they look to like no conflict, no enemies. The enemies just kind of like push them a little and then like it's all over,
Yeah.
And I think as I grew as a writer, like I saw the need to have more conflict in my stories, because I feel like that's what really drives like a character to grow. And in Spin the Dawn, like the darkness in the stories didn't come to me at first, but it just kind of grew naturally through friction with other characters, and then like a darker, more fantastical enemy just kind of naturally emerged. Right. as I plotted the story. So it's still something I'm working on as a writer, but hopefully it comes across well in Spin the Dawn.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I mean, it is always interesting to see kind of how an author, from what angle an author dives into this story. So for Spin the Dawn, like did Cutthroat Project Runway-esque parts come later? Was that maybe injected more in revision, or was it always?
It was towards the beginning, but I was more focused when I first came up with the idea of the book. I was more focused on her family and the tragedies they had faced from war within the country. Like the book takes place after a civil war, so you don't really see the war in book one. But I was more interested in the repercussions of what had happened in the war on the character in the beginning, and then she has to face the world from there.
Okay. Right. And I'm really curious with your book, since your book does balance the natural and the supernatural. You know, you have this richness in the Puerto Rican culture there, but also, of course, you know, it's there is, you know, just as dark of a side with like the plot. And so how did you balance that as well? You know, that light and that dark.
Yeah, it's, you know, it was challenging for me because I'm in love with the island, and so I wanted to pass that on, that and get people excited about Puerto Rico, but I've always liked horror, and I think it's interesting because right now with coronavirus, there's all this push for lighter reading, and I actually think it's the opposite. I think in many ways, especially for teens, being able to read something dark, it makes you feel better about the stresses you're already dealing with or the real life problems. And so I think through the image of El Cuco in the first one, I was able to deal with, you know, the concept of addiction, which is something that affected my childhood a lot. And in Category 5, you know, the hurricane, my mother lived through the last Category 5 hurricane in the 20s. And so this way you can deal with the troubles in your own life seem at least there's not zombies, you know, you can make yourself feel better about sort of the darkness in reality. So it was a challenge, particularly because I do think of the island as sort of, I have a romanticized view of it because I didn't grow up there. I grew up in New York City. So, but to the light and the dark, that balance, what you were talking about, is very important, and it's challenging.
Yeah, and also I love that you bring it up in the context of what teens want and need, because when I think about what I love about YA, it's this theme of hope. You know, I think our books can be dark, but there's hope. And so you said, you know, there's addiction and there's natural disaster, but with like viewed within the lens that you just brought up, you know, of our readers, when you say addiction, I think recovery. When you say natural disaster, I think recovery as well. You know, it's there is a light at the end of these very dark tunnels. So that is an interesting way of thinking about that balance, while still maintaining that need for tension that Elizabeth, like you said, keeps the reader turning the pages. You know, it's tension is so necessary. Or I know you said for growth, but I think it serves both purposes, right? It's growth, and then also it's propulsive. Janella, I mean, with yours, it's not literally a dark underbelly, but like you have a behind the scenes going on here with the circus. So talk to me about that.
Yeah. Well, I guess whenever I write stories, I sort of gravitate towards writing worlds that are kind of like Snow White's apple. It looks really delicious and like awesome on the outside, but when you take a bite, it's not so great. Okay. Like I love seeing like, I would like call this book very like glam dark, where like it's very glitzy and glamorous, but there is definitely that undercurrent of darkness beneath it. Okay. And I feel like Anne and Elizabeth definitely touched upon the things that I really look toward in my writing. Like there's a magical competition, so there's a lot of cutthroat behavior. There's a lot of personal darkness that seeps into the story. And then that whole balancing light and dark, all this dark stuff is happening and everyone kind of has to pretend that they're like not like that they're all okay, which feels very relatable right now. We have to like kind of just keep going even though pandemic's happening.
You know, we're all like suffering inside.
Yeah. When I look at my book, I'm like, ooh, I feel like I predicted a lot of things that are happening right now, and I feel bad.
we never as wide.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot.
We never want to be the predictor of these things, right? With our books.
But we are prophets of doom unintentionally, I think.
Yeah.
Which is definitely true of my book too, sadly enough. But yeah, I feel like the darkness that creeps through, it comes out kind of organically, like especially when it comes to the things that we can't like subconsciously, I feel like darkness creeps through in my stories.
Yeah. And last but not least, Coco.
I should also point out at this point that I can't actually hear anything Janella is saying, so I'm sorry if I'm just like sitting here and not responding like at all. I don't know why. I think like everyone else can hear you, but I probably can't.
Because my laptop fan is like whirring, so I don't know if my audio sounds very weird.
No,
It sounds fine.
I still can't hear anything from yours, but it's okay.
I guess the internet wire between Janella and Coco's.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so for me, I think when I started writing Shadow Frost, I had a very good idea of like good versus evil. But now that I think I'm growing as a writer, and like one of the big themes in book 2 is like the anti-hero. So I'm a really, really big fan of like morally gray characters. And I think it's more interesting, especially when you have, you know, a series where you can see characters grow through like multiple books. It's been really great not picking some characters, but having some characters change over time and slowly either, you know, become, you know, on the upper side of like morally gray versus, you know, on the more evil side, because I think people change in real life, and it's not something that just like happens in a split second. So it's been really interesting for me to explore just like what circumstances and like what personality traits might trigger, you know, a later evolution into like a darker place for a character.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Great that you brought up kind of the difference in how you're approaching characters in book 1 versus 2.
Yeah.
Because that's also another thing I want to talk about is character building, because I think there's no world building without character building, right? Without the characters who inhabit that world. And it's always tricky as an author because, you know, we could create pages and pages of profiles for all of our characters. But the trick is really, you know, how much we choose to show. You know, trying to create not just a protagonist, but a cast that is real or feels real and is fully formed without inundating the reader with details and backstories. So Coco, I know that your readers particularly love your cast of characters in Shadow Frost. And so let's start with you. What is your general approach to character building? I know you touched on it a little bit, so maybe expand on that, especially within a complex, brand new world.
Mm-hmm. So I think the biggest challenge with Shadow Frost and just the whole series in general is that there are so many points of view. I was really inspired by Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. It's one of my favorite books, and the cast of characters in it is so spicy. Like everyone is super, super different and unique. And so I think when I first started writing the book, I had an idea of like different archetypes sort of you know, what characters I wanted to represent in the book. But as, you know, as they were like immersed in the plot and that kind of thing, and they started doing their own thing, they diverged slightly from those archetypes. But I think the most important thing for me when character building is just like asking what the character wants, like what they're willing to do to try and get it, like what are their motivations and like what the stakes are for them. And I generally try to figure out like if there's, you know, if this character has a tragic backstory that's like moved them to where they are today, but also just like fun personality quirks. Like the main character really, really loves cake, and that's like a very personal reflection of myself. And it's just been really fun working with this huge cast because, I mean, like, of course it poses its own challenges, but because, you know, they're very unique and each character has, you know, a different kind of relationship with another character. So you have all these really interesting and like intricate webs about like of how they interact with one another. So that's been really fun to just play with. But I guess the best part of it was just that, you know, given that they were like, they are teens in the book, and when I was writing Shadow Frost, I was also a teen. I guess I'm still a teen, but it was really nice just getting to imbue them with like stuff that, you know, conversations that I've had or like habits that I have, and, you know, mistakes also, a lot of mistakes. So
yeah. for the rest of you, where where does the inspiration for your characters come from? And specifically, I'm curious, Anne, I know because I think Elizabeth and Janelle, you both have kind of similarly big casts, right? Casts of characters. And you have these two, you have Javier and Lupe, but then they go into this world, and I think it was described as myths and legends, a world of myths and legends. And so, you're pulling from, not just your own toolbox and people that you know, but from these rich myths and legends. So can you talk to me about your character building process just within that context?
Sure. It's interesting, people ask me which character I most relate to. And I think Javier came out of this sort of desire to show a different side. And it's almost like they're different parts of my own. And in fact, Marisol, who was a secondary character in the first book, ended up being one of the narrators in Category 5 because she sort of represented a bit of my anger about anti-colonialist feelings and, issues with how the island was treated during the hurricane. And so all of them have different sort of aspects of my own personality. And in terms of the supernatural, El Cuco is very interesting because he exists in pretty much every Latin culture, but he has by different names very often, but nobody could say really what he looks like. And I found that fascinating. It's an archetype again, this sort of monster that can change shape based on your fear. And so I like the idea of treating him with respect, So as a character, Stephen King has El Cuco in The Outsider, but he's a very dark character, and I wanted to treat him with respect. So he has, somebody was talking about the grays, it's sort of the in-between and the anti-heroes, and he's not just, an evil monster. He has his own purpose. So.
Yeah. And Janella and Elizabeth, what's your approach to character building? Especially, you have the Taylor competition, the circus. You also have these kind of like opportunities to create really like interesting, diverse characters in every sense. And so, how is that for you?
Do you want to go or
you want to go? We're gonna do that thing where we're like, you go first.
Okay.
Go.
So again, I'm going to go a little bit back towards like my first few books. When I first started out writing, my characters, I kind of always based them on myself, just because I know myself and it was easy to do that. But then with each manuscript I worked on afterwards, I moved further and further away from myself. But with Spin the Dawn, I kind of came full circle again. And in many ways, Maya Tamarin, the spark of Maya Tamarin was inspired by some of the experiences I had as a composer. I think of Maya very much as an ambitious, talented seamstress, as a craftsperson. And that's the same way I thought of myself for the longest time as I was struggling to become a composer, a film composer specifically. Mainly, like I had a bunch of experiences in the film industry where people would tell me like that I might as well give up because there's no chance I'm going to make it in the industry as an Asian and as a female. And every time those comments came back to me, I would just get so angry, even though there was nothing I could really do about it. You just have to smile and be like, oh, haha, so funny. And so that memory has always stayed with me. And when I first started writing Spin the Dawn, I just, that became the spark for Maya Tamarin, because in the very first chapters, you find that she's this talented, hardworking seamstress and has these brilliant designs, but nobody pays any attention to her just because she's a girl. And that is what really motivates her to enter this competition and to prove herself and to prove her worth. And I would say that's a big part of her personality that drives the story.
Yeah. Janella?
I feel like my characters in Where Dreams Descend, I feel like I got to cheat a little bit because with the Phantom of the Opera meets Moulin Rouge, I kind of had a blueprint for those those core three characters. Like I wouldn't necessarily call them like my Christine Raoul phantom, but I'm not calling them that. But like, I think there's something to be said about like when you're like, I wouldn't call my book a retelling, like a traditional straight up retelling. I like to call it a reimagining because when I approached these characters, it was more like, what if Christine wasn't scared all the time? What if she actually was, you know, very proud of her talents and wanted to make something of herself outside of the phantom shadow?
Right.
So, yeah. So a lot of
mentioned that you gave yourself permission to not just, you know, rejig or set the names, but the motivations.
Yeah, and then that in and of itself changes the story a little bit. Yeah. So like it kind of has like a similar phantom vibe, but because the characters are kind of crafted with different motivations now, it takes a lot of more detours than the original thing, which I found very interesting in terms of building the character and how that affected the world and the rest of the story from there.
And did you feel like those motivations maybe came from, I mean, I guess they would have, right? From a more personal place, whether that's just, you know, other influences or experiences.
Absolutely. My main character, Kalia, is actually the most bold, confident character I've ever written. I feel like before I would always write really quiet, shy, reserved characters because that's who I was when I was a teen.
Yeah.
But with this book, I really wanted a character who, you know, knew she was powerful and owned it. And I think it really is credited because during the time I was writing it, I was on sub with a book that wasn't doing well. And so I needed an outlet for me to say no to all the no's that I was getting.
Yes.
So it's a very cathartic book where I was kind of like trying to empower myself through this character. So her wants and motivations sort of entangled with mine as I was drafting the story.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense, and I think ties into what Elizabeth you were saying also about, you know, the people you were talking to about film composition.
I was also on sub with a book that didn't do well, so high five. Whenever it's been the dawn, yeah.
They say write the book you needed as a kid, but what they don't tell you is write the book that you desperately need when you're on sub.
Yeah. When I was working on Spin the Dawn, like that book wasn't doing well at all, and I was just like, you know what? I'm just gonna write what I want to read, and whatever.
Janella, I know you also, so I know you were saying it's Phantom of the Opera and Moulin Rouge inspired. I saw online we were just talking about there being Moulin Rouge nods in there, little references and nods and Easter eggs. That's I think always such a cool thing about you know, speculative worlds or fantasy worlds is when they kind of make little nods like that to other worlds, fantasy or real. So I mean, for all of you, how do you decide that balance between nodding to media that already exists or some of your favorites? You know, like I love to make Harry Potter references in my books, which is definitely a thing, you know, I think all of us are maybe reconsidering. But you know, how do you balance that? And then do you have any personal favorites in terms of references and nods in your books?
I think I definitely reference anime quite often. I'm working on a new book right now it's kind of hard to work those in when the book is set, you know, like in a totally different universe with like kingdoms and no technology and that kind of thing. But I'm working on a book right now that's set like sort of modern day in New York City. And so there's like a ton of like real life references in there. Yeah. I also really like to take like 221, the number 221 from like Sherlock 221B and like sneak it in, or like names and that kind of thing. I always find that really fun. But I think the biggest reference in my book, and obviously like with Elizabeth and Janella, is like fairy tales, and like especially like, you know, ones that have been like produced by Disney and that kind of thing. In Shadowfrost, it's like very loosely based entirely on Snow White. So there's like the princess and, you know, the queen, and there's like a hunter who may not actually be bad, and like the seven dwarfs, which is like Astrid's seven friends. And also I think it was really fun to do it in a way that's like very subtle. So I know I had a lot of readers who didn't realize that it was a Snow White retelling in a way until like the end of the book, and someone was like, "Oh, so did you like the Snow White references?" And then like everything comes together suddenly.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite do this. I didn't quite have the same approach with Godstorm, because I wanted to do like mini fairy tale references, kind of just like subtly in there. So there's Cinderella, there's Rapunzel, and a bunch of other ones. So I'm looking forward to seeing if like people can spot those like little references here and there. So that will be really fun.
The cool thing, I mean, I think we're all familiar with the fairy tales, but I saw on Twitter an author was talking about how he just started watching Avatar: The Last Airbender. I mean, he mentioned anime, but you know, this is a YA author who just started watching, and he's like, "Oh my god, I'm like already just a few episodes in, seeing so many little like ways that other YA authors have like, you know, woven this into their stories."
Yeah, I mean, my book is like all the magic is elemental based.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have.
Yeah, I didn't even watch Avatar, and I know like
exactly.
Waterbender, Earthbender.
Yeah. I don't know if any of you played Club Penguin, but
oh my god, yes!
There was
Yeah, you got all the influences in your book, Coco.
Yeah, like, because I know Club Penguin had like a dojo, because someone mentioned Avatar, and I was like, wait, oh, and then I was thinking about because I hadn't actually watched Avatar at the point where like the first person who mentioned it had mentioned like, oh, maybe it's a reference. But like Club Penguin used to have like a dojo game where like it was like rock, paper, scissors, but it was with like fire, water, and ice, I think.
Okay.
And so I think like of all the things that could have influenced the magic system, it was probably that. But I don't think I've ever told anybody. Like this is my first time saying that. Yeah, so this is my confession.
I was gonna say that I use reggaeton. Music is really important to me, and I use reggaeton in both books. There's a reggaeton star, Carlos, and it's my family in Puerto Rico. You know, I tell them I like reggaeton. It's very urban, very young, and they're like, "Ay, Annie." But I just love it, and it's something that I can share, and so I like to bring that in because to me it's very much it has gone beyond Puerto Rico, but its heart is there, and so I like bringing that in.
Is Carlos inspired by any reggaeton star in particular?
Yes.
Or composite?
Thank you.
I knew it. I was like,
I'm obsessed with Daddy Yankee, who is sort of like, you know, I said to my nephew, he's the father of reggaeton. He goes, no, Titi, he's the grandfather. I'm like, oh. but his name is Papi Gringo, and that's sort of like a play on Daddy Yankee because I just love his music.
Okay. So he's Carlos, but Papi Gringo is his stage name.
Exactly.
Got it.
Exactly.
That's awesome. And then Janelle and Elizabeth, any nods, any references, any shameless plugs in your book?
Oh yeah.
Well,
honest, I feel like.
Were you just blasting like Phantom of the Opera and the entire time you were writing?
Oh yeah, no, so much Phantom, so much Moulin Rouge, and I feel like there are a lot of obvious Easter eggs, and then a lot of really subconscious things that I didn't realize were in there until a friend was reading. Like, did you mean to do this? And I'm like, no, sure, no.
Yeah.
Which is like always so funny, but like I feel like the way that I bring in like different stories that were inspirations into my books there are a lot of like recurring motifs, like for Phantom, you know, the mirror is a big part, roses are a big part, and if you look at the cover, chandeliers are a big part of Phantom, but my character is sitting on it, so. But yeah, it's always fun to sprinkle in those fun bits, and when people actually acknowledge them, and then you feel like you did a good job.
So satisfying.
It's so satisfying.
And Elizabeth, you know, your book is Mulan meets Project Runway, and so talk to me about your references and nods.
So there's definitely Mulan and Project Runway are the obvious references, but I do pull a lot, almost exclusively from fairy tales and legends, like myths and legends from around the world. Like the dresses of the sun and the moon and the stars are inspired by a French fairy tale called Donkey Skin about a princess who receives dresses of the sun, the moon, and the sky. And then during one of the competitions that Maya has to face, she has to make shoes out of non-fabric material, and she ends up making glass shoes, glass slippers. So that's like a little nod to Cinderella. There's a bunch of those in the book, and yeah, so it's and a bunch of actually Chinese references to fairy tales that I loved as a child, like references to the sun god and the story The Cowherd and the Weaver, which I loved, which is a romance about two star-crossed lovers who can only meet once a year over a bridge of magpies, but I changed it to stars.
Nice. I love that. All right, so we are now going to move into audience questions. We got a couple of audience questions on social media. So let's start with the first one, which is, how do you hope your books will inspire readers who look like your characters? And I love that question, especially for this group, because I realized right before the panel, we're all POCs. You know, this is, it's such a diverse group, and I think that's a great question. You know, what do you think, what do you hope that your readers will take away, especially the ones who look like your characters?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. It was really important for me to write a story that was rich with my background. I guess because when I was a kid, like my favorite Disney princess was Snow White, simply for the reason that she was the only princess with black hair at the time. And so I just growing up, like I would try to read as much as I could by other Asian authors, but there really wasn't that much, especially in fantasy and for young people. So when I started writing Spin the Dawn, like it was so refreshing to just incorporate some of the folk tales and legends that I grew up with. And my aim really was for readers who are familiar with these stories to see them and to remember their childhood and like just to see themselves reflected in the story.
For me, I in Five Midnights, I dealt a lot with Lupe, who is half Puerto Rican and half gringa, as she calls herself. And it's very much, I wanted to reach kids who straddle those lines. And I often get asked, I tell them I'm half Puerto Rican. They say, funny, you don't look Puerto Rican. And my response is, funny, you don't look like a bigot. But it's complicated to feel one way and look another. And so I sort of dealt with that in hers. And she was very defensive in Five Midnights. And somewhere between that and Category 5, well, all the characters sort of evolved in between on their own. And she sort of has come to peace with that by Category 5, that identity, duology of her life. And I thought that was interesting because she sort of worked it out between the first and second books. But I wanted to kids who are straddling to be able to to find a character they can relate to.
Right. Yeah. And I love that, just kind of the way the transition from the first and second book from, being able to acknowledge the anger, the confusion, but then come to peace with that,
Exactly.
And, yeah. Janella.
I feel like what I really hope is that when people read Where Dreams Descend or any of my other books that come after this, that readers who look or relate to my characters are able to think of themselves outside of the ways that we were conditioned to think of ourselves growing up. Because I know that in my experience, being surrounded by American pop culture, there wasn't a lot of Filipino representation. There wasn't, a lot of brown girls wearing beautiful dresses or anything. I think the first instance I saw that was in Cinderella with Brandy and Whitney Houston, which was one of my big inspirations behind this book. A lot of people don't know, but to be able to see like so many people of color just in these glamorous settings was so revolutionary for me. And I always wanted to see that in a book. But because I didn't see a lot of that, I felt like I wasn't allowed to be in those spaces. And it's like, am I even allowed to be like those kinds of characters? So I hope that readers, will feel like, we can take up space and we can make those spaces for ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. And Coco, any last words, additions?
I don't know if this was mentioned by Janelle again.
Oh, right, because you can't hear.
It's okay. For me, the biggest thing in the Shadow Frost series is just like the power of young females. Like the main character Astrid, she just if she wants something, she's gonna see it done. And that for me, you know, being a young writer in an industry where like I rarely get to meet people who are my age, who are publishing. It's been really inspiring because I've gotten the chance to speak with other, you know, young people who want to see their dreams, you know, achieved. And, you know, usually like it has to do with writing or like publishing, or that kind of thing. But Astrid is like a reflection of me, you know, knowing that people have told me, like Elizabeth, you were saying with composing, like people telling me like, don't even try, like, you know, you're so young, like just wait until you're like in your 20s, like you'll have a much better chance. And I'd be like, why? Because like, even if they hadn't read my book. So for me, it was like proving those people wrong. And also Astrid is, you know, a reflection of that, you know, people telling her, you know, there's no way this can happen and that sort of thing. But she doesn't care. She's very stubborn and bullheaded, and she gets it done anyway. I think that is what I want other young people who are reading, you know, the book to also just believe in themselves and have confidence that no matter, you know, what they look like or what age they are or what their circumstances are, like it's still possible to achieve your dreams.
I think that's a really great point, and you know, such a big reason that we're writing these mirrors and windows, right? You know, for kids who look like us who maybe didn't have these kinds of characters growing up. Real quick, just the last question, which you know, is what do you hope your readers to take away from your book? You know, if there's one sort of big picture message, big picture idea that you hope that they walk away with, what is it? And we can start with Janella.
I feel like literally everything I just said, but also I hope that people find a really awesome escape in this book, because I found it to be a really, you know, fun escapist project to work on. They became very personal to me. And I know that we're in a time where we all need to escape what's happening right now. So I hope that people have fun and find, like, you know, a nice escape in this book. And I'm so happy that, you know, a bunch of readers already have. So.
Nice. And Elizabeth, Coco.
I hope they see themselves in one of these characters, because that was, I mean, you know, I'm much older than everyone in this group, and there was no YA, and there's very little representation when I was growing up. And so the idea of having somebody, a reader, being able to see themselves in one of the characters is very meaningful to me. So that's a hope of mine.
Yeah. Elizabeth.
I would agree with that as well. There wasn't a lot of representation in YA for me when I was growing up. So I'm also hoping that readers see themselves. But I also want readers to see that in Maya, she's just like a simple seamstress who is very ambitious and hardworking. I want them to relate to her personality as well, rather than someone being like a chosen one with a sword. Like a sword doesn't have to be your weapon,
right,
for instance. And so I hope that, yeah, she has a needle instead and scissors. So there's lots of different types of heroes, and I hope that readers will identify with her as being a sort of different one.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of a tagline I had seen for a different fantasy book: "Not all wars are fought on the battlefield."
Yeah,
and that's such a powerful takeaway for readers. And Coco, final words. No pressure.
I guess my answer to the previous question relates pretty heavily to this one as well. One of the biggest takeaways I've personally had after publishing Shadow Frost and continuing to write more is that there are a lot of young writers who really want to publish, who have like written full manuscripts, and they just have no idea how to go about the business of publishing. And being 15, I also had no idea what I was doing. I still like basically have no idea what I'm doing. But it's been really, like, social media has been such a big help for me to communicate with these readers and other young writers who are aspiring to publish their books. So I guess what inspires me to write more is just like these people who are, you know, who say to me, like, the fact that you did this and I don't know anyone else, like my family doesn't believe that I can write at this young of age or publish or become an author, that kind of thing. So you are like the proof of that. So that's been super, super inspiring for me, because I know how difficult like parents and like tiger parents and helicopter parents can be when you're pursuing something that's not necessarily like the conventional standard of like what they want for you. And I guess it's been a really fantastic way for me to get that message out and reach out to people who, you know, need help with like publishing or have questions about like querying agents and like all of that just industry stuff, because that's, you know, that's like a necessary step unless you're self-publishing, which also has like a lot of other steps. It's like a necessary step in order to publish. So it's been really great for me to just like connect with all of these young readers, and like through Shadow Frost and through like the book, you know, being around the world and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's been really, really, really inspiring.
It's awesome. Well, I'm really glad that we all got to connect today on social media, or well, I guess right here on StreamYard. And thank you to the Bronx Books Festival for providing us this platform and making this panel happen. Thank you guys for making the time to talk about world building. And over to Olivia.
Yes, thank you all so much for participating. Thank you to Anne, Janella, Elizabeth, Arvin, and Coco. You can find all of their books at thebronxisreadingbooks.com. Please get their books and support them. They are all amazing authors and moderators, and I'm just so grateful to have had the chance to listen to you all talk today. So thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.